The bus came in the morning. That detail matters. Not at night. Not under the cover of some bureaucratic darkness you could at least explain to a child. Morning. When the light was up and the dew was still sitting on the grass and Ramona's mother had already started the stove. The smell of the stove. Wood smoke. The particular sweetness of cedar burning. Something cooking on the iron surface. That smell was in the house when the bus appeared at the far end of the road. And it was still in the house when the bus left. And Ramona's mother was still standing at the stove, or near it, or in the doorway. And the smell stayed while the children did not. It was a big green bus. That is how Ramona Klein describes it, 72 years later, sitting in a circle in Bismarck, North Dakota, her hands folded in her lap and a single eagle feather resting on the altar cloth in front of her. Big and green. She was 4 years old in 1952, so the bus was large the way everything is large when you are 4. Larger than reason. Larger than the house, filling the entire frame of the window where she stood watching it come down the road toward the Turtle Mountain Reservation. She had 5 siblings. The oldest was maybe 14. The youngest, besides Ramona, was 6. Their mother knew what the bus was before it stopped. She had known it was coming. That also matters. The removal of children to boarding schools was not a surprise raid. It was an administrative event with advance notification. Letters sent to families, sometimes appearing months ahead of time, sometimes weeks, sometimes arriving after the bus was already on its way, depending on the postal service and the county agent's diligence or lack of it. Some families received the letter with enough time to do something. None of them had power to do anything that would change the outcome. The letter was not a request. It was an itinerary. Your children will be picked up. Here is the date. Here is the school. The expectation of compliance was written into the letter's form the way a verdict is written into a court document. The words leave room for acknowledgement, but not for refusal. Ramona's mother had 4 years to prepare for Ramona's removal, which is another way of saying she had 4 years of knowing it was coming, which is not the same as being ready, which is not something you can be ready for in 4 years or 40. She had watched it happen to other families. She had watched the bus come for children she knew. She may have, in whatever internal reckoning she made, tried to prepare Ramona, tried to give her something to hold on to, a word, a song, a way of knowing who she was that would survive what was about to happen. Or she may have been unable to do that, may have been unable to speak of it without shattering, and so said nothing, which is also a form of preparation, the preparation of silence, which is its own kind of protection and its own kind of wound. There is a moment in Ramona's testimony, and she has given this testimony now in ceremony, in a circle, with Charlie Brissette beside her and the smell of sage still faint in the air from the opening prayer. There is a moment where she pauses, not for effect. She is not performing. She pauses because the thing she is about to say has weight that requires her to prepare herself to say it. She says, "My mother was crying before they even got off the bus." She already knew. That is the thing you have to hold on to as we go forward. The mother already knew. This was not a surprise. This was not a misunderstanding or a rogue actor or a policy gone wrong in one isolated county. This was the machine running exactly as designed. The bus came every year. The families on the Turtle Mountain Reservation had been watching it come for nearly 80 years by 1952. It had been coming since 1874, sometimes under different names, sometimes painted different colors, sometimes driven by men who believed they were doing God's work, and sometimes driven by men who didn't think about it at all. The bus driver on the morning Ramona was loaded onto it did not look at her mother. Ramona remembers this. She has remembered it for 72 years. He did not look at her. Fort Totten Indian School sits on the southwest shore of Devil's Lake in what is now Benson County, North Dakota. The buildings are still there. Some of them. The oldest structures, red brick, 2 stories, thick walls meant to last, were built by the U.S. Army in the 1860s as a frontier fort, and when the Army left and the government converted the property into an Indian school in 1874, it kept the walls and changed the purpose without changing the logic. Fort, school. The word for what it was sits somewhere between the two and doesn't quite match either. By the time Ramona Klein climbed the steps of that green bus in 1952, Fort Totten had been operating for 78 years. It had processed thousands of children. It had buried some of them. There are graves on that land that families are still trying to identify. It would keep operating for 7 more years, until 1959. And when it finally closed, it did so quietly, with no ceremony, no accounting, no apology. A school that ran for 85 years and ended with a notice. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition began its oral history project in 2024. Charlie Brissett, a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians, leads the testimony sessions. She describes her role as listener. Not interviewer. Listener. The distinction matters to her, and she has explained it carefully. An interviewer extracts. A listener receives. The protocols she follows come from indigenous frameworks of care, circles, ceremony, the understanding that testimony of this kind is a sacred act and not a data collection event. When Ramona speaks in that circle in Bismarck, she is not being recorded for a lawsuit. She is being witnessed. Charlie has a small scar above her left eyebrow from a childhood accident she doesn't talk about, and she has the particular stillness of someone who has learned to hold other people's pain without flinching and without looking away. She sits across from Ramona and she does not look at her notes. The coal smell hit you first. That is what survivors consistently describe. Not the sight of the buildings, not the sound of the gates, but the smell. Coal smoke from the furnaces that heated the dormitories, and underneath it something institutional, something that is hard to name precisely, but that anyone who grew up in a government-funded building in mid-century America might recognize. The smell of bleach over something older, lye soap, wool blankets that had been washed too many times in water that was never quite hot enough. The children who arrived at Fort Totten in the fall smelled their new life before they saw it. The regime at Fort Totten in the 1940s and 1950s was organized around 3 principles that the administration would have called education, civilization, and faith. The children who lived inside it experienced these principles differently. Education meant English, only English, at all times, enforced by punishment that escalated in direct proportion to the frequency of violation. Civilization meant the military schedule, réveillé at 5:30, calisthenics in the yard regardless of temperature, meals at fixed times eaten in silence or near silence, beds made to a standard, shoes polished, haircut. Faith meant Catholic Mass, morning and evening, attendance non-negotiable, and the gray nuns who ran the school alongside government-appointed staff. Women who had taken vows and crossed the Canadian border to do God's work among the savages, which is the word that appeared in their own institutional correspondence as late as 1931. The school's physical layout was designed to maximize visibility and minimize privacy. The dormitories were open bays. The dining hall had no partitions. The classrooms had glass panels in the doors. The only genuinely private spaces in the building were the staff offices and the bathrooms had broken locks on 3 of the 4 stalls in the girls' wing for most of the late 1940s. The maintenance record shows the repair request was filed in 1948 and completed in 1952. 4 years of broken locks. The record notes no reason for the delay. The education in the classrooms was real, in the sense that reading and arithmetic were genuinely taught, and some children genuinely absorbed them. This is one of the complexities that survivors navigate carefully when they talk about the schools. The insistence from outside that any acknowledgement of academic instruction must offset the acknowledgement of what else happened. It doesn't. A child can learn to read and also be beaten for speaking her language. These facts do not cancel each other. The school gave some children skills that helped them survive in a world that had been deliberately structured to require those skills. It simultaneously removed the skills, the relationships, and the ways of being that would have helped them survive in a different way, a way that was also valid, a way that was theirs. Ramona Klein can read. She can read beautifully, fluently in English. She will tell you this herself. She will also tell you what it cost. Sister Margaret, and this is a composite character built from the documented behavior of multiple staff members across the school's history, because the records don't always name the individual, but they name what was done. Sister Margaret was, by all accounts, a woman who believed completely. That is the most important thing to understand about her. She was not sadistic in the way that word implies pleasure. She had no obvious pleasure in punishment. What she had was certainty, a flat, load-bearing certainty that the children in her care were being saved. Saved from paganism, from poverty, from their own culture, and that the saving required the removal of everything that was not salvageable. The language was not salvageable. The names were not salvageable. The way they wore their hair was not salvageable. She would have found the word cruelty baffling. She was doing them a favor. She was also, by the partial accounts available, genuinely capable of warmth. This is harder to say, but it has to be said. Survivors describe her in terms that are not uniformly cold. She praised children who performed well on examinations. She kept a small jar of hard candies in her desk for students who completed their reading assignments ahead of schedule. On at least 2 occasions documented in letters she wrote to the diocese, she advocated for a sick child to receive better medical care than the school's underfunded infirmary could provide. She was a person who contained contradictions, the way all people contain contradictions, and understanding that does not excuse a single thing she did. It complicates it. The complication is important, because the complication is where the system lives. In the gap between a person's self-image as a benefactor and the actual experience of those receiving the benefit. She kept a leather strap in the top drawer of the desk in her office, which smelled of candle wax and old paper. The strap was 14 inches long and had a small crack near the handle end that she had repaired with a piece of black electrical tape. Children who were heard speaking Chippewa, in the yard, in the dormitory, anywhere on school grounds, were brought to that office. The punishment was formal. It was documented. The documentation used the word correction. The children knew the office by its smell before they knew it by its name. They knew the particular combination of wax and old wood and the faint sweetness of the candy jar that was never for them, and they knew what it meant to be told to walk to the end of the hall, which was the instruction Sister Margaret gave when she intended a correction. Not, come with me. Walk to the end of the hall. The phrasing put the walk between the instruction and the arrival, which was its own kind of architecture. You walked toward what was coming. You carried it in your chest for the length of the corridor, and you arrived at the door, already having done something to yourself that the sister did not have to do. Ramona was brought to that office twice in her first year. She was 4, then 5. The second time she had said a word. She describes it as a word she didn't even consciously choose, a word that came out because she was frightened of something, and the word for frightened that she reached for was Chippewa. Sister Margaret heard it from across the yard. She had that kind of hearing. She called Ramona's name in English, and Ramona walked to the end of the hall, and the strap left a mark on the back of her right hand that faded in a week. What didn't fade was the lesson, which was, the language lives in your body and will betray you if you aren't vigilant. The language is dangerous. The language can get you hurt. And still the girls whispered it under the blankets at night. Thomas Little Soldier was 6 years old when he arrived at Fort Totten in the fall of 1941. He is a composite figure, assembled from testimony and records of students who passed through the school in that era. But his story is not invented. Every element of it exists in some survivor's account. He came from the Standing Rock area, which meant he spoke Lakota, not Chippewa, and this linguistic difference meant almost nothing inside the school's walls, because both languages were equally forbidden. He was given the name Thomas upon arrival by a staff member who had a list of acceptable Christian names and pointed to one. His actual name, the name his mother used, the name that had meaning in his family's history, does not appear in any school record. It was never written down. He was small, even for 6. Fine-boned, with a habit of holding his breath when he was nervous that made his face go slightly pink. On the morning of his arrival, a staff member, the records indicate this was standard intake procedure, sat him in a chair in a room off the main entrance hall and cut his hair. Not trimmed. Cut. The braids that his mother had plaited that morning, that still smelled faintly of the cedar oil she used, fell to the floor and were swept up and discarded. The scissors were cold metal, and the staff member worked quickly, which was its own message. This is not an event. This is a procedure. This is something done to objects, not to people. Thomas held his breath. His face went pink. He did not cry. He was 6 years old, and he did not cry. And that is its own kind of information about what 6-year-olds on that bus had already learned about the cost of crying. Ramona's hair was cut the same way, 6 years later, in the same room or one like it. The room existed at every school in the system. The intake room, the transformation room, the room where you became someone different before you fully understood you were being changed. She describes it in her testimony with a specificity that time has not softened. The cold of the scissors against her neck. The sound, she does this. She makes the sound. A soft, snipping sound. The sound of it. And then looking down at the floor and not recognizing what was there. Not recognizing it as hers. The hair was practical, the school would have said. Easier to keep clean, less likely to harbor lice, more appropriate for a Christian institution. All of this may have been true, and none of it is the point. The point is that a child's hair, in many Native traditions, carries meaning that is not practical. It carries relationship, history, ceremony. You do not cut it without purpose, without ritual, without the understanding of what the cutting means. To cut it without permission, without ceremony, without acknowledging what you're taking, that is not hygiene. That is erasure performed with scissors. The children sitting in that intake chair understood this better than the staff member with the scissors did, and they understood it at ages when understanding comes through the body rather than the mind, through the cold of the metal and the sound and the thing on the floor that used to be part of you. Thomas grew his hair back. Slowly, in the year after he left Fort Totten. He was 17 when he left. And by then he had been Thomas for 11 years. And the name that had been taken from him had become, not gone exactly, but distant. Stored somewhere he could feel but not quite reach. He grew his hair, and wore it long for the rest of his life. And the people who knew him later in life knew him as a man with long gray hair who chose his words carefully and who had, when pressed, a specific quality of stillness that the people who loved him recognized as the stillness of someone who had learned early that making yourself smaller was sometimes the only available form of safety. The dormitory held approximately 40 girls in rows of iron frame beds with thin mattresses covered in ticking that crinkled when you moved. Blankets were gray-green wool, government issue, the kind of wool that itches through a nightgown. The windows faced north, which meant that in a North Dakota January, the cold came through the glass in something close to visible waves. Girls were not permitted to speak after lights out at 9 o'clock. The silence was enforced by a staff member who walked the dormitory floor twice before retiring, her footsteps audible from the far end of the room. This is where the machine made its first miscalculation. The staff member's footsteps were audible. That was the problem, from the institution's point of view. Because audible footsteps have a pattern, and children learn patterns the way water finds cracks. Not by effort, but by simple, patient attention. The footsteps came, and then faded, and then the dormitory door at the far end opened and closed, and there were approximately 11 minutes before the next pass. 11 minutes was enough. It started, as best as anyone can reconstruct from testimony, with a girl in the second row whose name the school recorded as Agnes, but who had another name, a name she had not forgotten yet. She began it as a kind of experiment. A single whispered word in Chippewa directed at the girl in the next bed. Not a conversation. Just a word. Proof of something. Proof that the word still existed. That she still had it. That it had not been taken along with the braids and the dress and the name. The girl in the next bed whispered back. By the winter of that first year, there were 6 or 7 girls who had worked out the system. Faces forward, bodies still, mouths barely moving, whispering Chippewa under the gray-green blankets while the cold pressed in through the north windows. They were not teaching each other. Exactly. They were reminding each other. Holding the language up between them in the dark to make sure it was still there. What they shared was specific. Not lessons. Not grammar. The word for pine sap in winter, which is different from pine sap in summer. The word for the particular ache of homesickness that sits in the chest rather than the stomach. The name of a place on Turtle Mountain that isn't on any government map. The name of a relative. The sound of a song that someone's grandmother sang. It was not a formal curriculum. It was a child's treasury. The things you hold on to when you're away from home and afraid that home is forgetting you. Ramona was 4 when she arrived, which meant her Chippewa was a child's Chippewa. The words her mother used when she was cooking or singing. The words for certain animals. Certain weathers. Certain feelings. In the dormitory, she learned more. She learned in the only classroom that was not surveilled. She learned in the 11 minutes between footsteps. We talked about home, she tells Charlie in the circle in Bismarck. We talked about what we missed, somebody's grandmother, somebody's dog. She pauses here. That's how I kept the language, because I missed my mother so much I had to say it in Chippewa. There wasn't a word for it in English that felt right. Charlie does not respond immediately. She lets it sit. The eagle feather on the altar cloth doesn't move. Then she asks quietly, "What was the word?" Ramona looks at her. Something crosses her face that is not quite a smile and not quite grief, and is perhaps both at the same time. She says the word. She says it once, in Chippewa, and does not translate it. That is deliberate. The coalition's protocols respect the right of a survivor to hold some things inside the language, untranslated, unextracted. The word belongs to Ramona and to Chippewa and to the dark dormitory where she learned it, and it is hers to keep or give as she chooses. She chose, that day, to say it and not explain it. The circle held it. This is the thing that the system, The 85-year system, the 526 school system, the congressional authorization, federal funding, Catholic mission system did not account for that children's need for each other is more durable than policy. That grief, pressed down hard enough, does not disappear. It goes underground and keeps moving. The language whispered under blankets in a government dormitory in North Dakota in 1952 was not a romantic act of resistance. It was a 4-year-old trying to hold on to the only proof she had that she had existed before the bus came. The Coalition's research has documented this pattern across multiple schools, multiple tribes, multiple decades. The underground language preservation was not organized. There was no adult teaching it, no curriculum, no plan. It was children, in the dark, in the margins of the institution, keeping something alive that the institution was specifically designed to kill. Some of it survived. Not all of it. The distinction matters, and we will come back to it. But first, the mornings, 5:30. And the bell was a physical thing. A brass handbell rung in the dormitory doorway by whoever had that week's duty. And the sound of it in a cold room is a sound that Ramona Klein can still reproduce. She does it there in the circle. Once, softly, the shape of the bell's ring in her throat. And Charlie's jaw tightens slightly, because she recognizes that sound from her own research, and she knows what follows it. The girls dressed in order. Beds made before the feet left the floor, tuck the corners, smooth the wool. The sequence was non-negotiable, and it was inspected. A staff member moved through the dormitory every morning after reveille with the specific posture of someone looking for failure. Not hoping to find it, necessarily, but trained to look for it, habituated to its presence, and therefore seeing it even in near-perfect compliance. A corner that was not sharp enough. A shoe that was not centered under the bed frame. The inspection's real function was not cleanliness. It was the installation of surveillance as a permanent internal state. The creation of children who inspected themselves, who preemptively corrected, who learned to see themselves through the eyes of the staff member before the staff member arrived. That is more efficient than surveillance. That is what you get when surveillance is consistent enough. Children who do the work for you. Into the yard for calisthenics, regardless of the temperature. And in November in North Dakota, the temperature is specific and merciless, in a way that the word cold doesn't adequately convey. It is the kind of cold that enters through the thin cotton of a government-issue exercise uniform and sits against the sternum like a hand pressing inward. The exhaled breath frosted instantly. The ground under their feet was frozen hard and rang when you struck it. A low, dull ring like something hollow. Boys in their yard, girls in theirs, separated by a fence that also separated the younger children from the older ones in a configuration that, as we will see, created a particular vulnerability. Mass at 6:15. The chapel smelled of beeswax and old wood, and the particular closed-air smell of a room used daily by many bodies and cleaned only to a Protestant standard of clean, which in a Catholic institution created an unintentional irony that no one remarked upon. The children filed in by size. They knelt when told to kneel. They rose when told to rise. The prayers were in Latin and then in English, and the children repeated them in English because Latin and English were both acceptable, but Chippewa and Lakota and Dakota and Anishinaabe were not. Kneeling on the wooden pew rail, there is a specific sensation that multiple survivors describe, the hardness of it against the knees through thin trousers or a thin skirt, the way it moved from discomfort to pain over the course of a long mass without ever quite crossing the threshold into something you were permitted to respond to. You held still. You held the pain the way you held the cold. As a condition of existing here. As a thing that the institution had decided was appropriate, and that your discomfort did not change. Father Bernard gave a homily every Sunday that, in survivors' recollections, returned repeatedly to the theme of gratitude. The children should be grateful. They were being given an opportunity. The world they had come from was, and this word appears in multiple testimonies as a word he actually used, benighted. From benightedness, they were being lifted. They should be grateful. Ramona Klein does not use the word grateful when she describes what she felt in that chapel. She uses a different word. She uses the word afraid. She was afraid of the priest, and afraid of Sister Margaret, and afraid of the night bells, and afraid of the particular silence in the dining hall when someone had violated a rule and the staff knew it and hadn't yet said who. The dining hall silence was different from the dormitory silence. The dormitory silence was enforced. The dining hall silence, when it came, was the silence of 40 children trying to take up less space than they actually occupied, trying to breathe quietly enough that the sound of breathing didn't draw attention. The sound of 40 children trying not to make sound. The minute creak of a chair, the swallowed cough, the silverware set down with exquisite care, is its own kind of sound. Once you have heard it, you don't forget it. Ramona hasn't. She was also afraid of a boy she knew only as Willard. Willard was 13 in 1952 when Ramona arrived at Fort Totten at age 4, and the age gap between them should have made him irrelevant to her daily life. Boys and girls were separated. Older and younger children kept on different schedules. But Fort Totten's physical plant was what it was. A converted army fort with corridors and outbuildings, and a basement laundry room that connected buildings in ways the administration had mapped but not fully controlled. Willard knew those connections. He was 13, and he had been at the school since he was 7, and he had 6 years of mapping the places where the institution's surveillance had gaps. What happened in those gaps? And this is documented. It is in the Coalition's research. It is in the testimony of multiple survivors who were children at Fort Totten in the late 1940s and early 1950s. What happened is not something that requires elaboration here to be understood. Ramona's testimony addresses it. She has chosen to speak about it in the circle, which required a specific kind of courage, and Charlie's role during that portion of the testimony was to hold the space without filling it. Which she did, her hands in her lap, the eagle feather not moving. What requires emphasis is the structure that made it possible. Willard did not fall through a crack in the system. He fell through a crack that the system had built into itself by concentrating vulnerable children in an institution that prioritized order over welfare, that measured its success by the children's silence and compliance rather than their safety. And that had created, through its punitive language policies, a world in which children could not easily tell adults what was happening to them in the language they felt things most precisely in. When you can only report harm in a language that is not your first language, in a language that adults use to discipline you, to a group of adults who have made clear that your own way of speaking is shameful, the silence is not weakness, the silence is arithmetic. Sister Margaret found out. Eventually. It took 2 years. It took a girl who was old enough and angry enough to report in English, formally, to Sister Margaret's face. The sister's response, as this girl later described it, was to look at her for a long time and then say, "You should not have been in that part of the building." That is the sentence. That was the institutional response. The school's records contain no further documentation of the matter. Willard's name, the name the school gave him, appears in enrollment records through 1954, and then stops. What happened to him is not in the file. He was approximately 15 when his name stops appearing. He was a child who had also been brought to that school on a bus, who had also lost his language, who had also been cut off from his family in a system specifically designed to sever those connections, and who had become, inside that system, a source of harm to younger children. The system produced him. It also buried him. Both of these things are true. Ramona Klein came home. That is a fact she states in her testimony without drama. The way you state a fact that is also a miracle. Flatly, because the weight of it doesn't require emphasis. She came home. Not all of them did. The children who didn't come home are in those burial sites. The 53 identified so far. A number that the Department of the Interior has acknowledged is incomplete, a number that will grow as the investigation continues, a number that each expansion makes heavier. Children died at boarding schools from tuberculosis, from influenza, from pneumonia that a better heated dormitory or a better funded infirmary might have treated. Children died from injuries that were not always explained. Children died from what we would now call neglect, and what the school's records often listed as failure to thrive, which is a phrase that tells you everything and nothing simultaneously. The graves were sometimes marked, sometimes not. Sometimes the families were notified, often not. The notification that would have mattered most, that a child was ill, that a child was in danger. That notification frequently did not happen because the school's relationship with the family was adversarial by design. You do not alert the people you are separating a child from that the separation is going badly. You maintain the premise that everything is fine. The premise was maintained until it couldn't be. Ramona came home. The house was the same house. The stove was the same stove. But something had shifted in the interval that she describes, carefully, as a kind of distance. Not between herself and her mother. Between herself and the person she would have been if the bus hadn't come. She came home speaking English more fluently than Chippewa. She came home with habits. The military schedule. The precision with which she made her bed. The physical flinching when a door opened unexpectedly. That her family could see, but not name. Her mother watched her daughter move through the house with the careful movements of someone who had learned to take up less space. There were things Ramona could not tell her mother. Some because of shame. The shame that the school had worked to install in her about what had happened. Shame directed inward where it had no business being. Some because the English words and the Chippewa words both felt inadequate to what they were being asked to carry. Some because her mother's face, when she looked at Ramona, had a quality of hoping, a taut, held-breath hope, that Ramona did not want to disturb with the truth of what hope had cost. So she said, "I'm home." And her mother held her. And the stove was going, and the smell was cedar and something cooking. And it was, for a moment, close enough. The moment lives next to the gap. Ramona has spent 70 years knowing both at once. Thomas Little Soldier, remember him, the 6-year-old who held his breath when he was nervous, had been at Fort Totten for 4 years when he stopped answering to his real name. Not because he had forgotten it entirely, but because the effort of maintaining it had become a kind of dual existence that was increasingly hard to sustain. He was 10. The name he had been given, Thomas, had accumulated 4 years of associations. Classrooms, drills, punishments, the specific texture of daily life. And his real name had accumulated 4 years of not being used, not being spoken aloud, not being reinforced by anyone around him. It was beginning to feel like something that belonged to a different person, a younger person who no longer existed. At 12, someone asked him his name, not a staff member. A new boy just arrived, small and frightened, sitting on the edge of his assigned bed, with his shorn hair still shocking white at the scalp line where it had been so recently cut. He asked Thomas what his name was, and Thomas told him Thomas, and the new boy nodded. And that was the moment. Thomas told it to Charlie's colleague during a separate oral history session decades later. He said, "I knew it was wrong. I knew that wasn't my name. But I also knew that Thomas was the only name anybody here would answer to. So I gave up the other one. I put it down." He paused for a long time. He said, "I've been trying to pick it back up ever since." The effort to reclaim what was put down at Fort Totten is the animating work of the Coalition's 2024 project. Charlie is not the only one doing it. There are researchers, tribal historians, language preservation specialists, oral history practitioners working across the network of 526 schools. Fort Totten is one. Carlisle in Pennsylvania is the one most people have heard of. But there are 524 others scattered across 37 states. And Fort Totten is important not because it was the worst or the largest, but because it is specific. Because Ramona Klein is specific. Because the green bus is specific. Because the specificity is what makes it real in a way that statistics cannot. 526 schools. Between the 1870s and 1970s. At least 50,000 children at any given time. The federal government acknowledged this formally in 2022 when the Department of the Interior released its Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative Investigative Report, the first government document to use the word assimilation alongside the word harm without a qualifying clause. The report identified 53 burial sites across school locations. It stated explicitly that the schools were designed to assimilate Native children by severing their connections to culture, language, family, and identity. It used the word trauma. It did not use the word apology. President Biden issued an apology in October 2024. Formal, official, the first of its kind from a sitting American president. Ramona Klein heard it. She was in her 70s by then, and she had been carrying the green bus for 72 years, and she heard the president say the words, and what she felt. She has described this carefully, in the circle, was not relief. It was something more complicated than relief. It was the particular feeling of being believed after a very long time of not being believed, which is close to relief, but also contains, pressed inside it, all the years that preceded being believed. You can't separate the belief from the waiting. You can't receive the acknowledgement without also receiving the weight of the delay. Charlie asks her, in the session in Bismarck, "What do you want people to understand?" Ramona is quiet. The abalone shell on the altar has a small dark smudge near its edge from the sage bundle that was burned at the opening of the session, and the smell of it is still present in the room, faint, the way it lingers in fabric and hair. She looks at her hands. She says, "I want them to understand that we were children. Just children. And we loved our mothers, and our mothers loved us. And someone decided that wasn't enough." She says it without inflection. She is not performing. She is 77 years old, and she has told this story many times now, and the telling has not made it smaller, which is what some people believe happens when you speak something repeatedly, that it loses its force. It doesn't. The force changes. What was once a wound becomes a scar, becomes something you carry deliberately, as testimony, as a choice. Ramona Klein has made a choice. She has chosen to be witnessed. She has chosen to drive from Turtle Mountain to Bismarck and sit in a circle and say, "I was 4 years old, and I was put on a green bus, and I want you to know that." The language question, did it survive? Partly. The Chippewa language is listed as endangered. The number of fluent speakers is in the hundreds, concentrated among the oldest living members of the Turtle Mountain Band. The girls who whispered under blankets in the dormitory preserved something, but something is not everything, and the generation that would have transmitted the language fully, in daily life, in the natural course of family. That generation was in dormitories in North Dakota learning to be silent. The linguistic gap is not abstract. It is counted. Linguists who work with the Turtle Mountain Band have documented it as a direct and measurable consequence of the boarding school system's 85 years of operation. You can put numbers on the loss. The numbers are devastating, so I won't call them devastating. I will say, there are elders who know the word for a particular kind of winter light, and there is nobody younger to give it to. What Ramona preserved, she has given to her grandchildren. She teaches them in the kitchen the way her mother taught her. Words for the weather, words for animals, words for the feeling of missing someone so badly, there is no English word for it. The transmission is incomplete. She knows it's incomplete. She teaches them anyway with the determination of a woman who put something down at age 4 and spent the next 73 years walking back to pick it up. The red brick buildings at Fort Totten are still standing. The state of North Dakota maintains the site as a historic landmark. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which means the federal government considers it historically significant and worth preserving. The designation does not specify for whom it is significant or what kind of significance is meant. The buildings don't have plaques that say, "Children were punished here for speaking their own language." The buildings don't have plaques that say, "We cut the braids of 6-year-olds and swept them off the floor." The buildings stand in the cold North Dakota air the way buildings stand. Patient, indifferent, outlasting everyone who made them what they were. There are families from Turtle Mountain who have gone back to look at the buildings. Some of them find it necessary. Some find it impossible. Ramona Klein has not gone back. She has said, simply, that she doesn't need to. She carries the building with her. She has been carrying it since 1952, and she knows every room. The coal smell comes back to her sometimes, she tells Charlie. Not as a memory, exactly, as a sensation. She will be in her own kitchen and something, a particular cold draft, the sound of a bell at a certain distance. And suddenly, the smell is there. The bleach and the wool and the older thing underneath. Her body remembers what her mind has spent years learning to hold carefully. This is what psychologists call an intrusive memory, and what Ramona's culture calls something else. A visitation, maybe, or a wound that wants to be seen. She has stopped arguing with it. When it comes, she breathes through it. She has learned to breathe through a great many things. Charlie Brissett has been doing this work for 3 years now. She has sat in circles with survivors from multiple schools, multiple tribes, multiple decades. She has heard testimony that she will not repeat outside the circle because it belongs to the person who gave it, and not to anyone else. She carries those testimonies the way you carry something heavy that you have chosen to carry. With your whole body. Leaning slightly forward, adjusting your center of gravity to accommodate the weight. She tells her own story carefully and selectively. She is a member of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe, which means the history of boarding schools is also her family's history, which means she is not a neutral listener, which she says openly. She does not pretend to a neutrality she doesn't have. She says, "I'm listening as someone who knows what this cost. And that's why I can listen." The 2024 Oral History Project is ongoing. It is a race against time that the project coordinators will not use the phrase "race against time" to describe because the phrase implies urgency at the expense of care, and the project has committed to care. But the math is simple, and the project coordinators know the math. The survivors of schools that operated through the 1950s, which Fort Totten did. Those survivors are in their 70s and 80s. Some of them are in their 90s. Every year, testimony that exists only in a living person's body disappears when that body does. The federal government took 150 years to say it was wrong. The people who could say what wrong felt like from the inside are running out of time to say it. The legal history of this system is worth pausing on, because it is the part that makes the system visible as a system and not as a series of isolated decisions. The Indian Civilization Act of 1819 authorized federal funding for schools that would, in the words of the act, habituate Native peoples to the arts of civilization. That word, habituate, is doing enormous work. You habituate animals to captivity. You habituate organisms to changed conditions. The word imagines Native people as beings who must be conditioned rather than persons who might be educated, and the distinction between those two verbs is the entire moral distance between schooling and assimilation. The Civilization Act was followed by the Indian Appropriations Act, and the Indian Appropriations Act was followed by policies that removed tribal nations from their land and placed them on reservations, and the reservation system was followed by the boarding school system, and each piece was built on the prior piece. Each authorization made the next one easier, and the whole structure rested on the legal fiction that Native peoples needed to be civilized, which rested on the legal fiction that they were not, which rested on 400 years of European ideology that the United States inherited and codified and funded at the rate of millions of dollars per year. Commissioner of Indian Affairs Thomas J. Morgan wrote in 1889 that the goal of the boarding school system was to break up the tribal mass, to get the Indian out of the reservation and into white society, to accomplish, and this is his word, absorption. Absorption. He meant the total dissolution of a distinct people into the majority population. He said it plainly in official federal correspondence, and Congress funded the effort, and the buses ran, and the schools filled, and the children who came back, when they came back changed in ways their families could see and could not always reach. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978. The law passed specifically to stop the removal of Native children from their families and communities, is still being challenged in federal court. Brackeen v. Holland reached the Supreme Court in 2023, and the court upheld the act, but the challenge itself demonstrated that the legal infrastructure built to protect Native children from removal remains contested ground. The bus hasn't disappeared. It has changed form. It wears different paint. The logic that put children on buses in the 1950s, the logic that said Native children belonged somewhere other than with their families, somewhere they could be remade. That logic did not die when Fort Totten closed in 1959. It went into other institutions, other policies, other forms. This is the part that is hardest to say without turning it into a lecture, which I don't want to do because this is not a lecture. This is Ramona's story. But Ramona herself makes the connection. She makes it in the circle in Bismarck without prompting, looking at her hands. She says, "It's still happening. Different ways. Same idea. The idea that our children don't belong to us." She says it, and the room holds it, and Charlie holds it, and the eagle feather on the altar cloth doesn't move. The apology came in October 2024. The president stood in a room and said the words. The words were real words, legally and morally significant. The first time a sitting American president had formally apologized to Native peoples for the boarding school system. Ramona Klein watched it. She is not unaffected by it. She is also 77 years old, and she has watched many rooms contain many words, and she has learned the difference between a word and an action, and she is still watching. What she wants, what she has said clearly in testimony, is documentation, record keeping, the names, She wants the names of the children who went to those schools and didn't come home. She wants the names of the children in the 53 identified burial sites. She wants the records that the schools kept, the enrollment logs, the punishment logs, the medical records, the correspondence, to be made accessible to tribal nations and to the families of survivors. She wants the language preservation programs to be funded at a level that matches the scale of what was taken. She wants, and this is something she says with the particular composure of someone who has decided to say the hard thing plainly. She wants people to stop being surprised. She wants people to understand that this is American history, not Native American history, American history. It was funded by the federal government. It was authorized by Congress. It was operated by American institutions with American money and American legal authority and American silence. The bus was American-made. It ran on American roads. It was driven by a man who didn't look at the mother standing in the doorway, and nobody told him to look. The session in Bismarck ends the way all coalition sessions end, with ceremony. The circle closes in the way it opened, with intention and care, and the specific protocols that Charlie has been trained in, and that the survivors have helped to shape. Because this is their testimony, and their history, and their ceremony, and not anyone else's to run. The eagle feather is lifted from the altar cloth and held for a moment. The abalone shell with its dark smudge. Someone sings, softly, briefly, in Anishinaabe. Ramona Klein buttons her coat. She is going back to Turtle Mountain. She will drive the 90 miles on Highway 2 through the flat white country, through the kind of landscape that looks empty to people who don't know how to read it, and that is full of information to people who do. She knows this land. Her mother knew this land. Her grandmother knew this land in ways that were not preserved in any document, and are preserved now only in the particular knowledge of the oldest people who learned from the oldest people, a chain that boarding schools spent 85 years trying to cut at every link. She drives home. The session is over. The testimony exists now in the Coalition's archive, which is not a federal archive, which is held by Indigenous people, for Indigenous people, on their own terms. That matters. The terms matter. In the archive, Ramona's voice. In the archive, the 4-year-old who did not know what a big green bus meant, who had not yet learned what to be afraid of, who was watching out the window when it came down the road. The bus came in the morning. That detail still matters. The school is closed. The driver is long dead. Sister Margaret is long dead. The leather strap is gone. The dormitory is a historic landmark. The punch cards and enrollment rolls are in boxes that families are still trying to access under Freedom of Information requests that can take years. The government has apologized. The apology is real, and it is insufficient. And it is both of those things at the same time. And it will remain both of those things until the names of every child in those 53 burial sites are returned to their families. Until the records are open, until the language programs are funded, until something changes in the present tense. There are 526 schools. The Coalition has documented them. Most Americans have heard of one. A handful can name 3 or 4. The children who were on the buses, tens of thousands of them across a century, are the grandparents and great-grandparents of people who are alive right now, driving on American highways, shopping in American stores, working in American institutions, carrying in their bodies the consequences of a policy that the government has now admitted was wrong. Ramona Klein is 77 years old. She is in good health. She will keep testifying for as long as she is able. And she has said this plainly and without sentimentality. Because sentimentality is a luxury. And she has never had much patience for luxuries. She has work to do. But the survivors who can still speak are fewer every year. The ones who could not survive long enough to be believed. Who carried what happened to them on the bus and in the dormitory and in the laundry room corridor all the way to their graves. Their testimony exists now only in the consequences that their children and grandchildren live with and don't always have words for, in any language, to explain. The bus came in the morning. The mother stood in the doorway and cried before it even stopped. The driver didn't look at her. And the youngest child, 4 years old, pressed her face to the window of that big green bus and watched the house get smaller and smaller until the road curved and the house was gone. She has been trying to find her way back to that doorway ever since. So has this country. One of them is still trying.